Hi, this is Erica Merrill, and I'm the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And I am very excited to bring to you today attorney Fred Rutolo. And he is an attorney with the Stewart Law Group. They are out of Phoenix, Arizona, and they specialize in family law. And today we are going to be talking about a very interesting topic and one that I don't talk about too often, but I do have like a personal case of this in my own family, and that is the military divorce. And I'm so excited to talk to you today, Fred, about this. So, welcome to the show today, Fred. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So, what I am told is that in your past, you were in the military, and in fact, the National Guard. Can you tell us a little bit of that? Is that why you decided to specialize in this type of law?
Yeah, my timing with the military, with the National Guard, shortly was cut short for law school. And then having left law school, I fell into family law. And then with a little military background, it did attract clients who were in the military. Also, being in the Phoenix area, we do have a large Air Force base here, Luke Air Force Base. So there were service members who looked for people who had military experience.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to have someone with the military experience. I know that if you go to an attorney that does not specialize, there are going to be several points that we are going to touch on today that they may not know a lot about, and having an attorney that's guessing at certain topics and situations could cost you a lot of money for the rest of your life. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and we'll talk about this later as we go through it, but usually that area of concern is with the military retirement. Military retirement, I like to say, is full of minefields. So it is better having an attorney that is more familiar with military marriages, military divorces, military assets than an attorney that doesn't have that experience.
That is so true. And like I said, I definitely have that personal experience within my family with that, and it gets ugly. But let's go into a few other differences between a military divorce and a civilian divorce.
Good question. We've touched on that already by mentioning retirement. I think the biggest difference between a military divorce and a civilian divorce is going to be that retirement asset. The military is one of the few occupations that still have what I call an old-fashioned pension. A lot of people a little older than me will remember the old railroad pensions or the steel factory pensions. Those are pretty much all long gone. But the federal government, military still has a pension, and that's what is one of the bigger differences than a civilian marriage. So when dealing with that pension, there are some unique aspects of it. First, a lot of people will say, "Oh, I've heard about this 10-10 rule. I wasn't married to the military spouse for more than 10 years, so I don't get anything from his military pension." Is that true? No, that's not true. And sadly, I have heard some people say that. And again, they'll come and say, "Oh, I've heard about this 10-10 rule." Well, what that is, it simply means that if you've been married to the military spouse for less than 10 years, and that military spouse has had less than 10 years of service, then all that means is that DFAST, Defense Finance Accounting Service, that DFAST is not going to be processing that non-military spouse's share of the retirement, okay? But less than 10 years of service, less than 10 years of marriage, the non-military spouse is still entitled to that share of retirement that was accumulated during marriage. It's just the military spouse is going to have to make direct payments to that non-military spouse. And on we're talking about payments, when do these payments happen? Well, that military service spouse has to retire. And upon retirement, then the calculation is done to determine the exact amount that the non-military spouse is getting. So a non-military spouse might have divorced somebody at, say, 15 years into the marriage, and then that military ex-spouse has 5 years left of active duty. So it's after those 5 years and after that military ex-spouse retires, then the non-military spouse is going to start collecting. And that's similar to a civilian pension as well. But the 10-10 rule tends to be a big difference. Also, there's notice requirements that need to be made by the non-military spouse upon the divorce taking place. And sadly, if some of those notices to defast aren't made, the non-military spouse can even be excluded or lose their right to the military retirement. Another interesting aspect of the military retirement that we tend not to see with civilian retirement pensions is when a military person separates from the military, they're going to be given some sort of disability rating. It's probably very rare to leave the military without any disability rating. Well, that disability, those years of service could be converted into disability. Now, how does that affect the pension? If those is that disability payment now entitled, or is the non-military spouse now entitled to what has now been converted to disability? And the law on that, believe it or not, has changed over time. Where the non-military spouse was entitled, then the non-military spouse was not entitled. So that is another issue that needs to be addressed in the military divorce.
Wow, it sounds like there's some myths that we're busting here today when it comes to the 10-10 rule and what people feel like they are entitled to. And it sounds like there is that landmine with, hey, is some of that pension turning into disability? And I mean, have you seen some non-military spouses collect the disability because it is an income?
The status of that now is it's not collectible. So the non-military spouse will not receive that disability portion.
Do they change that with all of the divorces that have already finished, or are all the people that have that in their agreement, is that grandfathered in?
The law changed so long ago that any divorce currently is not going to have conflict with that. It's going to be that disability portion is not subject to allocation to the non-military spouse.
And that's really a loophole that you can't do anything about as the non-military spouse. Is that correct?
That's correct. There is one area where there is up to the discretion of the parties, and that would be the survivor benefit. So when the participating spouse or the military serving spouse has his pension, he's going to designate a survivor. So if he passes away, what survivor is going to continue to receive the military pension? Well, if somebody's only married 11 years or so and they're still young, does that military ex-spouse want to keep his or her ex-spouse as the survivor? Maybe not. Plus, there's a cost to the participating spouse, the military service spouse. There's a cost to have that survivor benefit allocated. So even if the military spouse says, I want my ex-wife to remain, or ex-spouse, I want my ex-spouse to remain as the survivor, then there's an issue, who's paying for that survivor benefit? And sometimes the military spouse will, sometimes the surviving ex-spouse will, or sometimes we do a ratio, maybe 50-50, or maybe some other ratio. And all these things need to be negotiated, and that's why having an experienced attorney who's familiar with this stuff tends to help.
Wow, that sounds very, very complicated. You said something really interesting the other day when we were talking about the pensions and why they are split, especially in the military, with the non-military spouse. And I think you said something like, look, they've been following them around throughout their career and they haven't been able to build their own career with their own retirement. I mean, is that, I don't want to misquote you on that.
No, that's a great point. And in essence, you hit the nail on the head on the concept of divorce law in general. I practice in Arizona. Arizona is one of the 9 what we call community property states. And a community property state is whatever's accumulated during the marriage should be divided or allocated as equally as possible. The law says equitably, but that's translated pretty much to equally. And again, this community property concept follows this concept of common sense. What you said, if one spouse is a stay-at-home spouse and the other spouse is accumulating wealth, God forbid, in case of a divorce, why should that stay-at-home spouse be excluded from the assets that were earned during the marriage? And that is the whole concept of equitably allocating assets. And that answers the question, why is this non-participating spouse getting 50% of the service member's retirement? And I should be careful when I say 50%. I don't want to scare anybody who's been in service for 19 years and only married for 5 years. When I say 50%, I mean 50% of what was accumulated during marriage. So years of service pre-marriage, years of service after the divorce are not counted. They're not allocated to the non-serving spouse. It's just the years of marriage.
Well, that's good to know. And you're right. I mean, this is so complicated. I would never suggest to anyone that they could do their own divorce anyway, like if they're just a regular old civilian divorce. But when it comes to military, it can be so different. And, you know, do you see this changing within states? Do the laws that pertain to a military divorce change within states, or is it the same across the board because it's one organization?
Excellent question. And it's the latter, what you said, it's one organization. Obviously, the military pension is governed by federal law. So the state law isn't going to step on the toes of federal law. In fact, unrelated to pension, but since you brought up federal law, and this goes to spousal maintenance or alimony. In Arizona, they call it spousal maintenance. It's alimony. If a service member receives VA disability, and then the spouse wants to calculate alimony, which is heavily dependent on how much the person makes, the person that's going to pay the alimony, how much does that person make? That's going to heavily influence the alimony amount. But that VA disability, by federal law, is not allowed to be included in that person's income. So let's say a person gets another $1,000 a month in VA disability. When a family law judge calculates alimony, that family law judge is not allowed to look at that extra $1,000 a month. And that's dictated by federal law.
Wow, that's very interesting. Do you see this in military divorces where perhaps the military person is earning money under the table and you have to try to figure that out to calculate it in? I mean, there's a lot of hidden assets. Well, I mean, I'm not going to say a lot, but occasionally there are hidden assets and people don't know what their assets are when they are getting a divorce. Do you find this to be the case with a military divorce, or is everything just pretty much above board?
That is an excellent question. In fact, that might be one of the advantages or one of the easier parts of a military divorce, because it is so much harder to do moonlighting in the military. And plus, your military pay is all public information, right? Anybody could go online and see what an E3 makes or an O3 makes. And then all the extra benefits, the housing allowances, the hazardous, the hazardous duty pays, et cetera, et cetera. All this is all public information. So it's hard for the military service member to be hiding assets. You're going to see that more in a civilian divorce. And where you're going to definitely see that is when when one of the spouses works for themselves. And yes, there's the other spouse is always convinced that we're leaving something on the table. They must be leaving something on the table. And when somebody works for themselves, even with them being 100% honest and no malicious intent, it's still hard to track what they've got, because they're telling the IRS legally they're telling the IRS, well, this is my income. But they're allowed to take things like depreciation and expenses if they work for themselves. They're not lying. That's their legal federal income to report to the federal government. But the divorce court says, hey, we're not going to allow you to take depreciation of some assets when we, as the divorce court, calculate your income. So even without any ill will, without even an intention to hide assets, you're still going to have two different incomes. One income that's legally allowed for the IRS, and one income that the divorce court's going to take into account. And you'll see, to your question, we see less of that with a military divorce, because the soldier, sailor, service person just simply doesn't have that opportunity to have those other career opportunities while they're active duty.
That is so true. And if you are self-employed, you can almost fix what you make depending on if you have employees or not. So you just pay yourself less, you can pay more employees, and then it looks like you are not as profitable during that period of time. Of course, I do go back a few years to try to make sure that you have like an honest income, but it just depends on how long that person was planning to leave. So you're right. It does get more complicated with the civilian divorces when it comes to those that, what you're making and sometimes your assets. But the other very, very tricky piece to the military divorce is what happens with the kids and with custody, especially with deployments. So I can't wait to hear, what you have to say about this. I have a friend who was going to go to Germany, and she decided not to follow her husband.
Good question. And we all know that in the military, the military families tend to move through every 3 years, every 4 years. There is a lot more movement within the country and around the world with a military family. We all had friends. We all have friends who say, "Oh, I'm a military brat. I went to 13 different schools," right? So yes, when the family is intact, that's not a problem. Well, it might be a problem to move around that much, but that might not be a problem. But when you're divorced, what happens? So let's use an example here. I'm in Arizona. We have Luke Air Force Base. Let's say we have a married couple with a child, and they live in the Luke Air Force Base area. Everything's fine. They're divorced. They get an equal parenting plan, 50-50. The father and mother have the child 50% of the year. Now the service member spouse is sent to another state, another duty station, or sent out of the country. What happens? Is the service member spouse going to say, well, I want the child to follow me to my next duty station? And then the non-military spouse is going to say, I don't think so. I want the child to stay here in the Phoenix area. Well, that's going to be the same issues that a civilian is going to have, because ex-spouses, one of them might remarry and that new spouse have a transfer to another state work-wise, or that divorced spouse wants to move to another state on their own and take the child. So the relocation issue in and of itself is not unique to military, because civilians move too after divorces. And there is state law that the judge follows to help the judge determine, am I going to let this child move with the other spouse, or am I going to keep the child here? So in a military context, you're still going to have that same state law apply. The only difference is, for the spouse who says, no, I want the child to stay here in Phoenix, what are they going to argue? They're going to argue, hey, judge, the other parent is in the military. We know the other parent's going to move every 3 or 4 years. And let's say I agree that the child can move with the service member to Georgia. Okay. And then what happens? So now the child's in Georgia, then that service member gets sent, say, to Korea, where children are not allowed to follow the service member, or, a hard duty state, a hardship post. So now the child's, well, wow, my parents let me move to Georgia, but now parent is moving to Korea. Now where am I going to go? Am I going to stay in Georgia, or am I going to go back to Phoenix? So those issues are unique to military families. But in general, the whole issue of relocation is very similar to a civilian family. It's just the frequency that is the issue.
In general, they want to keep things as stable as possible for the child. And if you're going to be moving around, with a single parent, and like you said, they could end up somewhere that the kid isn't even allowed to go to eventually. That can be problematic for a child and their development. So I can see where that would be something to look out for. So for someone that's having a little trouble in their marriage and they know that their next post is going to be overseas, would you recommend that they stay behind and not bring the children overseas, to where now the kids could get stuck in another country and not be allowed back in the States for a while they're working out their divorce? And divorces can take years sometimes.
Correct. That's a very good point. If the military spouse is anticipating the divorce, I think that military spouse is going to want to move the whole family to Germany or wherever, or Italy, wherever, because now they're together and it's good, and they have a little bargaining power when the divorce happens. But you're right. Let's flip that. Let's say it's the non-military spouse that is anticipating the divorce. I think it would be wise for that non-military spouse to say, hey, I'm going to stay here with the child while you go to your new duty station. That's going to make it a lot easier for that spouse with the custody issues and just even the logistics of the divorce, because they're in their home city.
That's true. And I know that the friend of mine, she ended up meeting another military person because she was still living on that base and just surrounded by military men. Now she's going to be moving again, but her spouse retired and is back here. And so it's like all these decisions were made, but he's back here and they're going to be moving around a bit now. So it's just interesting how it works out when you're in the military, and marriages and divorces and that moving piece is really tricky sometimes.
Correct. And again, as we touched on earlier, even civilians will have that relocation issue, and the law is the same. It's not to the frequency that military families are going to have. And even in the healthiest of marriages, you pointed out, that moving around is stressful. I think when they're in their retirement and they look back, they look fondly that they had an opportunity to live all over the world and all over the United States, at no expense to them financially, at the military's expense, move them around. But yes, when you're a young parent with a 7-year-old or something and you have to change schools again, new city, new friends, it is stressful even in the healthiest of marriages. Now have those same problems in a marriage that isn't as healthy. And the military life is so stressful on marriages, even in the best of situations. So they have extra stresses that civilians don't have.
It's totally true. But yeah, you know what? It can, you're right. It happens civilian wise. My ex just moved a couple towns away and he wants our daughter to change schools because the school system's just a little bit better than here. And we moved here for this school system. So I'm like, no, we're not making one more change. It definitely can happen everywhere, but it is even trickier when they're moving to other countries and across the country. And so we've talked about some great topics today and some complicated topics, and we've busted a few myths that people have when they are regarding military divorce. Is there anything that we missed? Because we really had these two major issues to discuss. Any last minute advice or stories you'd like to tell?
That's a very good question. One topic we didn't touch on is child support. We'll see. I see this every now and then in a civilian situation and a military situation. If there's a child, obviously the parent is entitled to child support. Let me rephrase that more accurately. The parent that's making less money is entitled to child support, even if it's equal parenting time. The parent that makes less money is entitled to child support. Obviously, if there's equal parenting time, the child support is less than the parent who's paying child support. The parent has less than 50% time. And as you pointed out, divorces could go many months, sadly many years. So what happens while that divorce is going on? These are called temporary orders. Either parent could go to the court and file what's called a motion for temporary orders and ask for some temporary child support to be calculated to be a kind of a band-aid until the final numbers are calculated, until the final divorce is done. And this is called temporary child support. A military parent can do the same thing. A military parent could go to the court and say, we're in the middle of a divorce, I would like some child support calculated. But what the military parent has that the civilian parent doesn't have is the military on their own can order the service member spouse to start paying support to the non-service member spouse. In essence, the chain of command itself is making a temporary order. That can be done. Ironically, sometimes that number is lower than what the civilian court would calculate, the regular family court. So before that, I'll say financially dependent spouse. So before that financially dependent spouse does go to the chain of command, the powers to be, and say, hey, I filed this divorce action. Could you have the service member spouse start paying me support? Before they did that, they might want to see what the civilian number, for lack of a better word, what the civilian number would be. And that's usually the better way of doing it, is doing it through the civilian court, the family court. They're set up to do it. They can calculate it quickly. Even though divorces take a long time, we can usually get a temporary orders hearing done pretty quickly. So that is the one other difference that a military parent might have that civilian parents don't have.
Wow, that is a really interesting point and a great tip. I had no idea that they should go to the civilian court first for the temporary orders. And I do love that the military does try to take care of everyone. They get involved. Like you said, they might just write those orders up and make sure that if someone's getting behind in child support, they might just attach the wages for you. I mean, there's a lot of things that the military will do to make sure that they have honorable people in their midst that are working for them and that everything stays above board. I mean, do you find that to be true as well?
Yes, I agree. As we touched on before, there are so many stressors to a military family. I think the military does try to make an effort to protect the emotional and mental health and physical health of families. I think that's a very important part of the military. Of course, sometimes there's issues, but I think they do try.
Well, this has been really interesting, and I absolutely appreciate your time today. It is so rare to hear these facts and these tips about military divorces, and I know that the audience is really going to benefit from listening in to the information that you've given us today. So I want to thank you so much for doing this and coming on the show today. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here. Thank you.
You are welcome. And thanks so much to everybody out there listening, or if you're watching the video. We appreciate you and hope that you found this very helpful and informative if you or someone you know is going through a military divorce. We'll see you again next time. Thank you so much for listening.